Hello, this is for Journal Week 4. The first article is Body of Evidence, Dangerous Intersections Between Development and Culture in the Lives of Adolescent Girls. So this article details unrealistic body expectations placed on girls and women and how it affects them. It starts off by detailing an experience in a department store with a very skinny looking mannequin. The author tried to measure the mannequin and ultimately ended up meeting with the person who designs and dresses the mannequins and talking about these unrealistic proportions of the mannequins. The average woman in the US is a size 14 with a 38 to 39 inch bust, 29 to 31 inch waist, and 39 to 40 inch hips. And the mannequin all around measured about 6 inches smaller in all of these areas, which is really kind of disgusting. The article states that girls are constantly bombarded by images of women from a wide array of cultural sources, and consequently, their value is measured by physical attractiveness. These images can be found in magazines, television, other sources of media. On average, the average person comes across 14 attractiveness based messages per day. It was quoted in the article that for women, positive self concept hinges on perceived physical attractiveness, whereas for men, it hinges on perceived physical effectiveness, which I thought was a really accurate quote of the expectations in society. All of these images reinforce the expectation that girls should reduce their size and change their appearance through the restriction of food intake and dieting. Not only does this encourage girls to change their body shapes, but at a time like puberty or young adulthood, when they are mandated by cultures to change their identities and the essence of who they are and how they take on the world, and this also affects them in a emotional or psychological sense. A lot of this has led to dieting, anger, rebellion, and eating disorders. It is clear that the girls are responding to some kind of cultural demand. The article offers a couple of alternatives, three in particular. The first is that girls need to learn how to identify and critique cultural messages. So, not only absorbing the messages, but absorbing them in a critical way and questioning them. Two, girls need safe spaces where they will not be held to the cultural restrictions. And then three, girls need models of women and other girls who have had the courage to speak up against these cultural norms or expectations. The one thing I took away from this article was obviously how it affects me or how I can relate to it, which I definitely can a lot. Growing up, I definitely had some body image issues. I am 5 foot and have always been a very petite and small person. All of my friends were like 5'6", 5'7" in high school. Well, that's not like extremely tall. Weight distributes a lot differently when you're going through puberty, so while all of my friends who are 5'6" and over are just turning into these long string beans, I felt like I was just not attractive because of everything I was seeing around me in magazines, in television, all of these other things, and that definitely really took an effect on me to an unhealthy point. Um, Obviously, now I'm fine, but I can see how those images would kind of affect young girls like that. The second article was Naughty by Nature. This article examines the differences perceived by many in regards to African American children. It states that there are two representations of black masculinity. One, the image of the black male as a criminal, and two, the image of the black male as an endangered species. The article then examines youth and African American youth in a school setting, kind of interviewing teachers and other administrative figures within a school. It points out that children often behave in childish ways, and for a white child, this is simply seen as a boy being a girl or a boy being a boy, But for black children, they are seen as destructive, deviant, and violent because they are adultified. Adultified meaning that their transgressions are made to take on a sinister, intentional, fully conscious tone that is stripped of any element of child characteristics. This is a term that I have heard of before. In one of my other classes, I'm completing a minor in organizational leadership. One of the classes I took was leading the workplace through diversity, I think, and that was one of the issues we talked about was African American youth and how oftentimes African American boys and girls are perceived to be a lot older or have older characteristics than their white counterparts, and how those effects can really be detrimental to those kids. It details how black boys must be taught to enact a certain amount of docility to prepare for adult racialized survival rituals of which the African American adults in the school are especially familiar. So basically saying that they have to kind of enact this sense of giving in or pleasing other people, I think is what it was trying to say, in order to prepare themselves for the actual or intensified racism that they will most likely encounter in the real world, and how they have to, in order to survive that racism, I mean, in terms of like police and other things, they kind of have to learn to be passive. And what it kind of made me think about was one of my friends recommended watching the Central Park 5 documentary on Netflix, which is called When They See Us. I don't know if you've seen it, but it is really eye-opening and really, really, really intense. I'm only a couple episodes in, but essentially the Central Park 5 were a group of 5 boys who were arrested for raping and beating this jogger in Central Park, and there's really no actual evidence to convict the boys other than they were in the park. I mean, if you've ever been to New York City, which I have, Central Park is a very large park, and ultimately the fact that they were there, the police interrogated them without their parents there, pretended like everything they were doing in the park was, in a sense, what they were talking about in the article. It was being adultified in the sense that they weren't giving these kids any sense of being kids. They treated them like adults, and it was really, really unfortunate and upsetting. The third article is Class Act, Gender Communication in Education Settings. This article opens up by examining the experiences of 2 college students who are immersed in same-sex education settings or single-sex education settings, and then further examines gender in terms of education. The first thing that came to my mind with these single-sex institutions is how someone who was transgendered or non-binary might feel excluded from an educational setting like this, with it being single-sex. It kind of leaves out a lot of people and can create problems. But I can also see the benefits of attending an all-girls college and feeling more comfortable in that setting, in terms of not having the threat of a male there. That sounds bad, but I just mean, as a woman, you're walking through campus late at night, and you always kind of have to wonder and keep an eye out and be alert to what's around you. But I feel like in an all-girls school, you wouldn't have to worry about that, as well as your appearance. The article then examines gender in terms of literature and children's literature, brings up the valid point that a lot of children's literature enacts the typical fairy tale story where the strong prince rescues the princess in distress. It examines the effects that these themes have in children's lives and how it can go on to encourage children to conform to those gender roles and expectations. It brings up cultivation theory and how children may grow up believing that life is somehow supposed to be like the stories they heard and read as a child. It then goes on to analyze that a lot of women are left out of educational texts like textbooks, and primary emphasis is placed on a man's perspective of history. And then it discusses gender differences in the classroom and how different expectations are placed onto boys and girls in the classroom and how this plays out in high school and college. More than women, men tend to be more outspoken in class, interrupt more, and take more leadership roles. It also states that some studies show preferential treatment towards male professors than female, while other studies show no preference. However, most students prefer a heterosexual professor than a homosexual one and find them to be more credible, which is something I disagree with completely. I would not attribute credibility to someone's sexual orientation, but I guess not all college students think like that. It then goes on to explore harassment and where gendered harassment stems from. Harassment can come in a lot of different forms, and it isn't just between a person in power and someone below them. It can happen between peers and even in a reverse form with someone in a lower position harassing someone in a position of higher power. Next article was primary school studs. This article points out the researchers have begun to explore the ways in which sexuality, and more specifically heterosexuality, is embedded in the ways in which boys and girls define, negotiate, and consolidate their gendered selves. A lot of people think that a child is innocent and therefore isn't a sexual being. If they are a sexual being or sexually curious, it is believed or perceived that they have suffered some form of abuse. Children are assumed to be either immune to or passive recipients of sexual representations within an increasingly sex-saturated, entertainment and media-exposed or media-driven world. Thus, it is somewhat ridiculous to assume that children don't draw conclusions from the visible, invisible, and imagined sexual behavior of the adults and children around them, which I thought was a pretty profound and true quote. Typically, young girls' sexualities are the ones in question and studied or romanticized, such as books like Lolita or things like that. It is important to recognize that boys are central to the policing and production of girls' sexualities, but also that boys are inscribed within discourses of heterosexuality as they do boy. The article examines the ways boys engage with, practice, and occupy heterosexualities, and it is to explore how integral heterosexual performances are to the production of a real boy. The essence of a heterosexual person it lies within the subject of girlfriend or boyfriend. Therefore, having a girlfriend or being a boyfriend became an increasingly overt signifier for boys. The difficulty the majority of the boys in the study faced was an awareness that constructing their masculinities usually involved publicly dissociating from anything feminine, which included physical proximity or emotional closeness with girls. And as a result, some boys participated in sex talk, sexual fantasies, misogyny, sexual harassment, and anti-gay behaviors. The article then went on further to examine 3 boys who took the roles of professional boyfriends as an attempt to solidify their masculinity. The next article is Homegrown, How the Family Does Gender. This article examines how gender roles and differences play a role in the life of those who have immigrated here. Specifically, it examines the effects of the children on the children of women who have immigrated here, comparing the experiences and lifestyles of the female and male children. The mothers who immigrated here often were working a lot, placing a lot of responsibility for their siblings and household duties onto the girls. As a result, this led women to define, or these children who were women, to define education as the route to independence. The men's exemption from the adult responsibilities left them deprived of the emotional supports readily available to women. At an early age, women learned how to navigate a maze of institutions that were unfamiliar to their parents. And then women matured more quickly than the men did and simultaneously cultivated a sense of pride and appreciation for the struggles of their immigrant families. Um, Women consistently assess their educational and employment aspirations against the backdrop of the hardships of their mothers. They formed closer bonds with family. A lot of these immigrant women didn't date or actively engage in sexual activity as a way to secure their education and career. Since men were absolved from adult responsibilities imposed on the females, they did not compare their present situation with that of their parents. These men did not serve as institutional brokers for their families, and a lot of these men hung outside of the house and didn't have close family relationships. In fact, they would actively distance themselves from their mothers and pursue romantic relationships with other women, almost described in a way as where they were chasing other women. The last article was the meaning of motherhood in Black culture and Black mother-daughter relationships. This article examines the meaning of motherhood in Black culture and also Black mother-daughter relationships. It does so by addressing 3 questions. The first is, how have competing perspectives about motherhood intersected to produce a distinctly Afrocentric ideology of motherhood? 2, what are the enduring themes that characterize Afrocentric ideology of motherhood? And 3, what effect might this Afrocentric motherhood have on Black mother-daughter relationships? The article states that themes in white motherhood are problematic for Black women and others outside of this realm. Eurocentric views of white motherhood will continue to affect Black women's lives. Eurocentric perspectives on Black motherhood revolve around 2 interdependent images that together define Black women's roles in white and in African American families. The first image is that of the mammy, who is the faithful and devoted domestic servant. And then the second image is that when she enters her own home, this same mammy is transformed into the second image, the too strong matriarch who raises weak sons and unnaturally superior daughters. For African women, emotional care for children and providing for their physical survival were interwoven as interdependent complementary dimensions of motherhood. Another thing with African culture is continuing the lineage is essential in West African philosophies, and motherhood is similarly valued. While the biological mother-child bond is valued, childcare was a collective responsibility, a situation fostering cooperative, age-stratified, women-centered mothering networks. The 4 enduring themes found that characterize an Afrocentric ideology of motherhood are the following. 1 was blood mothers, other mothers, and women-centered networks. African American communities have recognized that vesting one person with full responsibility for mothering a child is not possible or wise, and therefore have other mothers and women-centered networks to help with this. And second is that providing is a part of motherhood. Providing is a part of motherhood. So in contrast to the cult of true womanhood, in which work is defined as being in opposition to motherhood, work for Black women has been an important and valued dimension of Afrocentric definitions of Black motherhood. The third theme was that community, other mothers, and social activism. So this talked about how Black women's feelings of responsibility for nurturing the children in their own extended family networks has stimulated a more generalized ethic of care where Black women feel accountable to all the Black community's children. The fourth and last theme was motherhood as a symbol of power. So motherhood, whether blood mother, other mother, or community mother, can be invoked by Black women as a symbol of power. There were 2 theories analyzed in this article in understanding Black mother-daughter relationships, the psychoanalytic theory and then the social learning theory. So that sums up all of the articles for week 4.